Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to view this presentation on positive behavioral interventions and support. We believe that the adoption of these core competencies into practice will improve the outcomes for children with behavioral health needs and their families. These foundational modules are developed to be viewed by family members, higher education students, paraprofessionals, and professionals. A list of resources and references have also been provided. This module will be presented by Eric Mann from the New Hampshire Center for Effective Behavioral Interventions and Supports at Ceresc. The New Hampshire Children's Behavioral Health Workforce Development Network is to build a sustainable infrastructure for the professional development of the children's behavioral health workforce based upon the core competencies and infused with the system of care core values and guiding principles. The need is for New Hampshire to have an adequate workforce and an infrastructure to support those who work with children, youth, and families. The New Hampshire Children's Behavioral Health Core Competencies were developed in 2011 by a representation of diverse stakeholder groups, including child-serving community mental health providers, family organizations, state policymakers, and university staff. The goal was that the competencies would be the first step in developing systematic and comprehensive human services development infrastructure. The competencies were developed using the system of care core values and principles as the foundation. There are 7 domains: family-driven and youth-guided practice, cultural and linguistic competence, childhood development and disorders, screening, assessment and referral, treatment planning, interventions and service delivery, systems knowledge and collaboration, and quality improvement. The competencies are organized for professional staff by levels of knowledge and skills in each domain. There are 3 levels: foundational, intermediary, and advanced. The levels are designed to identify the skill level of practitioners. They are fluid and not specifically tied to certain formal education and training or position titles. A copy of the report can be accessed, and a link is provided at the end of this presentation. This is one of a series of modules designed to support the development of core competencies in the children's behavioral health workforce. Since there are multiple tiers of social and emotional need among children in schools, a multi-tiered approach to behavioral support is needed. Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, or PBIS, provides a framework for a 3-tiered continuum of strategic and comprehensive social, emotional, and academic interventions and supports for children. Successful PBIS implementation takes time, patience, and school-wide commitment, but results in reliable systems, a prevention mindset, useful data, effective practices throughout a 3-tiered continuum, and positive school culture.
Robert Horner of the University of Oregon tells us that effective schools are consistent, predictable, and positive places. PBIS systems and practices support consistency, predictability, and a positive school climate, while at the same time help schools to be more systematic and more strategic in supporting the emotional, social, and behavioral needs of its students. In general, there are 3 types of students in schools. There are students who experience success every day, supported only by the general systems and practices in the school. There are also students who are at risk for disengagement or failure. These students need some added supports in order to prevent bigger problems. And lastly, there are students who need intensive and individualized support. Since there are multiple tiers of need, schools need a multi-tiered approach. PBIS schools strategically design and implement a 3-tiered model for supporting the academic and the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of its students. This begins by ensuring that all students have access to Tier 1 or primary interventions. Tier 1 interventions are school-wide and classroom-wide and are designed to support as many students as possible to meet the academic and social-emotional behavioral expectations at the school. But despite even the most effective Tier 1 supports, some students will need a little bit more. Those students will have access to Tier 2 interventions. Tier 2 interventions are designed efficiently as targeted group supports that address key functions of behavior and also address important skills. Students who require more intensive and individualized supports have access to Tier 3 interventions. Tier 3 systems are designed to develop and monitor individualized plans to support children's academic, social, emotional, and behavioral needs. The big ideas of PBIS begin with the development and implementation of 3 tiers of social, emotional, behavioral, and academic support. The first tier, Tier 1, looking at all students, school-wide and classroom-wide. Tier 2, looking at targeted group supports. And Tier 3, providing individualized and intensive supports. Another big idea in PBIS is the idea of strategic prevention. PBIS schools develop systems and practices that effectively prevent social, emotional, behavioral concerns. This happens through consistency and predictability by developing common expectations and working to strategically teach and support the implementation of those expectations and behavioral routines. PBIS schools also think strategically about response. We know that no matter how effective prevention strategies are, that we're going to need to respond to social, emotional, and behavioral concerns. The systems and practices that we develop are developed thoughtfully, carefully, designed to increase and improve the consistency and predictability of the environment, and designed also to produce data that will help us make decisions about the effectiveness of our responses. Another important PBIS big idea is the idea of using data to progress monitor and to guide decisions at all tiers. So whenever a strategy, a practice, an intervention, or a support is implemented in a PBIS school, thought goes into how is this strategy going to be implemented? How will we monitor for the fidelity of implementation? And how will we assess whether or not that strategy was effective? And the last PBIS big idea for today's overview is the idea that PBIS schools have a commitment to implement strategies and procedures with fidelity. That means that everyone whose job it is to implement a strategy knows the strategy, knows how to implement it, and in fact does implement that strategy as it's designed. Implementing strategies with fidelity, or as they are designed, allows us to look at the effectiveness data and really determine, did the strategy work or did the strategy not work? It's also important to note that PBIS should not be defined as a reward system, or as a program that catches kids being good. Even though PBIS systems will focus on the positive and will create a system in which positive behaviors are noticed with regularity and systematically, these types of descriptions are simplifications and don't accurately describe PBIS. PBIS is actually very complex. It develops for schools a comprehensive continuum of systems and strategies. The next series of slides will provide an overview of specific features of the three tiers of PBIS. We'll begin with Tier 1, school-wide or universal systems, practices, and data. The features of Tier 1, universal or school-wide systems, practices, and data begin with the development of an efficient and effective universal or school-wide team. That team is supported by internal coaches who not only help facilitate team process, but also act as a well-trained liaison to other school staff and to community members. Effective school-wide PBIS systems are collaboratively designed, developed, and implemented, utilizing school voice and family voice. School-wide expectations for behaviors are designed and developed for all locations within the school and all routines that operate within the school. Those expectations align with a cultural theme that becomes a vehicle for the delivery of the expectations. Expectations are taught strategically, using good teaching practices in all locations and within all routines. Within the teaching process and throughout the school year, students are recognized for exhibiting behaviors that meet the school-wide expectations. Those behaviors are noticed with higher frequency than we're noticing problematic behaviors. In response to problem behaviors, the Tier 1 system implements consistent and effective practices so that behaviors are less likely to repeat and behavioral concerns are less likely to escalate. In alignment with school-wide expectations, classroom expectations are designed to help teachers with effective classroom behavioral management and social emotional support. Throughout the Tier 1 systems processes and in rolling out school-wide behavioral expectations and teaching the different behaviors within routines and within locations, we utilize database decision-making to help guide the effectiveness of the strategies that we're using. And in order to identify early those students who are struggling to meet the behavioral expectations within the school, despite a good dose of effective Tier 1 systems and practices, we implement a systematic screening for social and emotional and behavioral concerns. School-wide expectations are usually those big ideas, those values that are commonplace among schools, commonly used in classrooms and used by teachers throughout the building. Typically, 3, 4, and maybe as many as 5 expectations are used to identify what we would call the big expectations within a school. Many schools choose to develop a cultural theme that becomes a vehicle for the delivery of the big expectations within the school. teaching expected social behaviors is a key component of effective PBIS implementation. In PBIS schools, we use the science of teaching, which means providing engaging instruction, practicing those social behaviors in the contexts that they're likely going to be needed, providing consistent and effective feedback, systematically noticing the behaviors that we want to see, and providing correction by demonstrating the behaviors that we want to see. Also ensuring that we implement the teaching strategies with fidelity as they're designed to be taught, and ensuring that in every case that we implement a strategy, that we are assessing the effectiveness of that strategy. Did it work or did it not work? Allows us to look ahead and improve each time that we implement a school-wide teaching strategy. If a behavior or routine is observable, it can be taught. In PBIS schools, we don't just tell kids what to do. We actually take the time to design strategies to teach and support the implementation of the behaviors and the routines that we want to see students engage in. And in response to concerning behaviors, we want to be very strategic and very consistent. So we send kids the message not only about the behaviors that we want to see, but also about the behaviors that are going to concern us and that we're going to respond to. So we define behaviors in both major and minor categories. We develop a consistent process for responding to those behaviors. We create data systems beginning with an efficient form to provide the key information around a behavioral event. We commit to the idea of gathering data consistently and accurately. And we commit as well to summarizing and reviewing the data. And lastly, not only to summarize and review the data, but actually use the data to inform our decisions and to guide us to better and more effective practices. The next section of this overview looks at the features of Tier 2, targeted systems, practices, and data. An effective Tier 2 system begins with an effective Tier 2 systems team. This team oversees the systems, the practices, and the data features within the Tier 2 system and aligns with other Tier 2 teams and processes that exist within the school's response to intervention system. Oversees and ensures effective communications with staff and families. Oversees an effective and efficient nomination and activation process that ensures that students who are non-responsive to Tier 1 interventions are provided efficient access to relevant Tier 2 interventions. The development of Tier 2 practices incorporates a function-based perspective so that the prevalent needs within the student body are addressed through Tier 2 interventions. Among those function-based Tier 2 interventions that are recommended is something called Teacher Check, Connect, and Expect, which provides added and scheduled adult attention throughout the course of a day, providing feedback on students' behavioral progress throughout the day. Other targeted group interventions are developed to address other functions of behavior and to teach important skills to students who need a boost in those skills, whether they be academic, social skills, emotional skills, or executive functioning skills. Any Tier 2 intervention must have a data-based decision-making component in that there must be data that shows evidence of fidelity of implementation of the practice and that also evidences the effectiveness of the intervention. Remembering the 4 E's of targeted group interventions help us to design those interventions. To be efficient, usually using similar strategies for groups of students who need similar support. To be effective, remembering to be certain that they're designed to decrease problem behavior. In other words, they do what they're intended to do. That they're evidence-driven, that we're using data to evidence the effectiveness of the intervention, and that they're happening early enough to prevent the need for more intensive and more individualized behavior support planning. Examples of targeted group interventions include interventions that address adult attention needs, like check-in, check-out programs, or mentoring, or service learning programs. Interventions that address peer attention needs, like peer mentoring, or interest groups that have peers with like interests, or academic, social, emotional, or executive skills instruction that have curricula designed, for instance, to teach organizational skills, or stress awareness and stress management skills, or homework planning, homework completion, group tutoring, or specific social skills instruction. The next section of this overview looks at the features of Tier 3, intensive systems, practices, and data. Tier 3 systems begins with the development of an effective Tier 3 systems team to oversee the systems, practices, and data features of the Tier 3 system. The Tier 3 systems team also oversees a well-thought-out and strategic school-based nomination and activation process for Tier 3, looking at those students with intensive needs who have been non-responsive to Tier 1 and Tier 2 interventions. The Tier 3 systems team will also oversee the implementation of a de-escalation and crisis response team, looking at the systems features for activating that team and assessing the effectiveness of the response team. And looking at the system for facilitated referral to community-based support, so that when a student's needs are such that they are beyond the purview of school-based practices and supports, that there's a process by which families and children are supported to find the services and supports needed within. Important Tier 3 practices include the use and understanding of conflict cycle, escalating behavior cycle, the use of life-space crisis intervention interview strategies, the ability to engage families who are in the midst often of difficult and challenging family crises, the ability to implement and develop intensive functional behavioral assessments and behavioral support plans, access to wraparound support services that help to create family-driven plans, and in high schools, the ability to have access to renew supports for students to create student-centered plans. Like Tier 1 and Tier 2, at Tier 3, database decision-making is part of the PBIS model. At Tier 3, we're looking at process outcomes, at fidelity of implementation of any behavior support plan that is implemented. We're looking at evidences of improvements in youth and family quality of life, evidence of improvement in the quality of life of staff as they're working with children with chronic and intensive needs, and other satisfaction data that is telling us that the Tier 3 system is operating effectively. The next slides provide a few data examples, general data examples from PBIS. This slide demonstrates a reduction in major and minor behavioral referrals over the course of 4 years in a New Hampshire elementary school. This slide shows a reduction in new special education referrals after implementation of PBIS from 2005 through 2009. This New Hampshire middle school was able to demonstrate a reduction month to month from year 1 to year 2 of PBIS implementation. This New Hampshire elementary school saw a reduction after a targeted teaching rollout on the playground from year 1 to year 2. This New Hampshire middle school was able to demonstrate a reduction in all behavioral categories after the rollout of a respectful behavior teaching process. This New Hampshire high school took a look at tardiness, decided to teach on-time behavior consistently throughout the school, and to sustain that teaching throughout the years. And this school was able to demonstrate the effectiveness on individual students of specifically and consistently teaching and reinforcing gentle hands and gentle feet. This concludes this module, and we'd like to thank you for viewing and listening to this module on positive behavioral interventions and supports.